And hopefully you're not like this guy right now after the presentation. But I'll be more than happy to take any questions right now. Yes, Andrew.
Intra-workout range change, what is the idea to do it based on the meal spacing, or is there its own?
Well, I think intra-workout was a product category that kind of invented itself in terms of people wanting something else to sell. But to be quite honest, I think intra-workout, if you have sufficient protein or amino acid before and sufficient after, I think it's probably overkill, to be honest with you. You'll hear a lot of people say, well, I sip on my branch chains while I work out. Well, I mean, based on the refractory data, that might actually be a bad thing, right? It looks like you want to bolus your protein intake. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know of any studies that they've looked at wound healing or injuries?
That's interesting. I can't tell you anything specifically because I don't know specific off the top of my head, but I do believe I've seen some stuff on particular amino acids helping with wound healing after some kind of damaging injury like a burn or something like that.
I think arginine and glutamine seem to work, and I just wondered if
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if it did, because leucine seems to be sensed in other tissues. Liver senses leucine levels, brain senses leucine levels. So I wouldn't be surprised if, skin and the dermis. And the other thing is actually when you take leucine, you're going to get increased leucine oxidation. When you oxidize leucine, you actually form glutamine. So if you give leucine, typically you will see glutamine go up because it'll flux out of the muscle cell. Because alanine and glutamine will actually go up typically when you give branch chains, because the branch chains to be deaminated in muscle so they can be metabolized by the muscle, they transfer their nitrogen, their ammonia group, onto either alpha-ketoglutarate or pyruvate to form either glutamine or alanine. So you may actually, what I'm trying to get at is it would be hard to pick apart if the leucine was having a direct effect or if it was from the increase in glutamine. But it may very well have an effect. I wouldn't be surprised. Yes?
Can you dig into just the basics of protein degradation?
Ooh, man. So basically, if you're looking at net anabolism, right? Protein synthesis is just one side of the equation. And net protein balance will be synthesis minus degradation, right? We don't have a whole lot of good information on degradation, okay? What we think we know is, I'll tell you what I think we know. No, you're fine. I'm not gonna make you stand up, that's fine. This will be quick. So let's say we're talking about 3 meals per day, right? So, and this is your rate, if you have 3 meals, this is your rate of muscle protein synthesis. Goes up, comes down, and then it goes up again, and then it comes down, and then it goes, oh, I'm running out of space because I'm not good at this. This is what you can tell I'm not a professor, right? Well, degradation, from what we know, tends to follow synthesis, okay? So when you eat a meal, degradation actually will also go up, but it will be lower than synthesis. Okay, so the absolute rate increases, but there's still a net positive balance. When you're fasting, when you're in the post-absorptive state, synthesis goes down and degradation also goes down, but it will be higher than synthesis, okay? And then the same kind of process repeats itself, okay? So your net, it's kind of like that, all right? And so this gap here is your kind of net. So, here you're in a net positive balance, and here you're in a net negative balance, and so on and so forth. The theory behind that is that degradation follows synthesis because as you're synthesizing new proteins, there's also going to be more that are misfolded. You're going to be getting rid of some of the old proteins as you put the new ones in, so that's why degradation goes up. Typically, the consensus is, and it may just be the protein community burying their heads in the sand because they don't have a really good way to measure degradation. The consensus is that synthesis is really the regulatory side of net protein balance, and the degradation just kind of passively follows it. And the only time that degradation is really regulatory is if you've got some sort of extreme condition like cancer or a burn or sepsis or something extreme, or maybe like an extreme caloric deficit. But the hypothesis right now is that it's that synthesis is the regulatory side. You're welcome.
Just a quick question. So there's a lot of people in the online community who say that, maybe didn't make you choke on your water there.
Careful now.
If this is all true about leucine, why can't I just take leucine all day? Why do I even need protein?
Good question, because you still need the substrate.
Right.
You still need the substrate. And actually, there's been a lot of, in particular, like branch chain products. There have been new branch chain products come out. Traditionally, a branch chain product is 2 to 1 to 1 leucine to isoleucine to valine. There's been now, since leucine has been hot, getting a lot of play, there's been some come out with 4 to 1 to 1, and then 8 to 1 to 1, and then 10 to 1 to 1, and then 12 to 1 to 1, and I'm pretty sure 1,000 to 1 to 1 is coming soon, And people have asked me my opinion on those. And my opinion on those is most of the data that shows any effect with branch chains is with the 2 to 1 to 1 formula. And that's probably because isoleucine and valine, leucine, isoleucine, and valine are metabolized in that ratio. So for the metabolism of every 2 leucines, you need 1 isoleucine and 1 valine. And we've actually shown that if you just give pure leucine, you will actually cause the levels of the other 2 branch chains in the plasma to fall. So you could yes?
Because it pulls them out.
Right, for oxidation. So you could conceive that, you could actually short circuit protein synthesis because those other 2 levels are dropping. So that's why I told people, look, there may be a better ratio, maybe 3 to 1 to 1 is better, or 4 to 1 to 1, but we don't have that data yet. So I recommend if people take a branch chain supplement, I recommend 2 to 1 to 1. And that's why the other amino acids are still important too. Yeah.
Related to, you said the ATP actually goes down in the cell.
Yeah.
So the question I've wondered, and maybe just purely a kinetics type issue too, is that you always have a fair amount of stored energy as fat, but
right.
your body just, in almost every process,
you're exactly,
does it really want to use that?
Yeah.
Is it just because it's too slow to help convert that?
I think you're looking at a kinetics issue because you're looking at ATP within the muscle. And actually the reason that Gabe got laughed at when he presented the idea of ATP going down in the muscles, people said, well, ATP doesn't change in muscle because if you exercise, your ATP levels still stay steady until you reach like a total of exhaustion. And what they're failing to recognize there is the hormonal aspects that mobilize fatty acids, right? That mobilize fatty acids really quick and deliver them to muscle so you can make ATP, so you maintain that ATP. So it's totally different than kind of an intrinsic difference that happens when you're talking about, this depletion. Now, I do think that by depleting ATP in muscle, your muscle would probably send some sort of signal, I don't know what it would be, to fat tissue to mobilize fat, right? So maybe, you're always getting a trade-off with anabolism and fat burning, right? What maximizes anabolism probably isn't the best thing for fat burning. And what maximizes fat burning isn't probably the best thing for anabolism. So when you're talking about body composition, it's also like trying to walk the tightrope, right? So if you're looking to burn more fat, maybe it's better if you're not maybe you definitely would want just that branch chain in between as opposed to a carbohydrate, so you have something with a low caloric yield so you still get some of those fat burning effects. Now I'm just tossing out ideas here. There's no data to back that up, but that's just my hypothesis.
You also have much lower insulin release too then, right?
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
should
Yeah.
push you more towards.
Although some people have, said that, whey causes a huge, massive release of insulin, which I don't buy.
Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that? Because the question that we always get is that branch chain amino acid or whey protein, does it always make people become insulin resistant?
That's using short-term data to prove a long-term theory.
So I'll go with this one.
It was good we got the wipe off board. I anticipated we might use it. So the problem with that theory is that, one, if you look at people who consume more protein throughout their life, they're more insulin sensitive. They're not less insulin sensitive. So the supposition is, okay, well, look at the end product, right? This is like when people tell me high intensity cardio is catabolic, I'll say, well, let's look at a sprinter and let's look at a marathon runner, okay? I realize there's other factors that go into that, but let's at least look at the end product and see how much weight that has. But one of the problems is when you're talking about insulin response, you're talking about a biphasic response in most cases, okay? So if you eat a carb-heavy meal, you're going to have an initial release of stored insulin because it will sense that you've eaten food. Your gut will release things like GLP and these other factors that tell your pancreas, you just ate whatever stored insulin you got, dump it now because we got glucose coming, okay? And then it starts producing insulin to get rid of the extra glucose. So you'll get like, a sustained response, and then eventually it will go down as it clears the glucose, right? With protein or with branch chains, typically only get the first phase of that response. You get the dumping of the stored insulin, okay? You don't get a sustained increase. And that makes sense because your body, your digestion is telling your pancreas, we got food coming, trigger insulin release, but then there's no sustained production of glucose. There's no sustained glucose. So, and if you think about it, just think about it in terms of play it out in your mind. If you had a sustained production of insulin, every time you ate whey protein, you would go hypoglycemic, right? Because if you've got sustained insulin pushing glucose levels down, you should go hypoglycemic. But that doesn't happen. So the other thing that people have misinterpreted is they'll take a measurement there and they'll say, aha, same insulin response. Well, you got to measure the whole thing, right? You've also got to measure the area under the curve. The other thing...
Before you move on, so here, it increases even with the branched-chain amino acid, even
yes.
though it's not the carb.
It's a transient increase.
But why ingesting protein would also increases the insulin?
Probably because, one, you've got signals from the gut telling you that you ate. So as your stomach starts emptying food into the duodenum, your digestive tract will start releasing. Now, that being said, I'm not a GI expert, but from what I understand, your digestive tract will start releasing things like GLP-1, and that actually signals to the pancreas that you've got food on the way, and you start releasing insulin. Leucine actually also seems to have like a direct effect on the pancreas in terms of releasing stored insulin, but not a sustained production.
So anything you eat, your insulin will just go up just because you eat something, kind of like a signal?
I would guess so. I haven't studied that research enough to definitively be comfortable saying. If you ate, 8 ounces of vegetables, would insulin go up? I'm not sure, But the other thing that people fail to realize is they'll look at signals like an IRS-1, which is kind of an insulin signal, and they'll see the same thing. They'll go, oh, well, in response to leucine, when we measure response, if you give leucine and carbohydrate, look, leucine actually makes it a little bigger if you give leucine. But what they don't look at is a little bit further down the road, we've actually done this in our lab, this response is shorter. Leucine actually truncates the response. So you get a lower area under the curve of actual insulin signaling in the muscle cell. So, yes?
So are you saying that maybe, I don't know if there are any studies to back this, but if that's the case, then if you have a person who is obese, who is insulin resistant, okay, over a period of time, it's not going to happen overnight,
Right.
but over a period of time, if you give them enough branched-chain amino acids and leucine, with those kinds of meals, over time, that insulin resistance will decrease?
Well, we didn't do it with branch chains, but Layne did a 16-month study with women where he either compared, I think I'm good, Nin, thank you. Until the next question, where he compared either like the food guide pyramid, 60% calories from carbs and 15% protein and 30% from fat, versus like a zone type diet, like a 30-40-30 diet. And actually showed that basically he could take people that had metabolic syndrome, basically pre-diabetics, and in just under a month, he made the blood work look like they didn't even have it. Just by, now the problem is that we all know, any trainers in here, I think I see a few, the attrition rate on people following a diet is extremely high, right? So when he could get them to follow it, yeah, I mean, it significantly decreased their insulin and blood glucose levels.
Now, at the same levels that you recommended, you know.
Yes, so he actually, he actually designed all the meals in that study around that threshold concept. So he made sure that in the 30-40-30 group, that each one of their meals had at least 2 grams of leucine to hopefully hit that threshold.
Other different kinds of protein.
Sure. Yep. This man was ahead of his time. He always, when I told him, the first day I got into his lab, he said, yeah, we typically think about 10 years ahead in this lab. And I thought he was just beating his chest. And by the time I graduated, I understood, no, we do think 10 years ahead. And sometimes that's a bad thing when you go to try to get papers published, because people, you can just tell when they're asking you questions from the paper, they don't even get the concept. So, but yeah, he designed, although this was back in 2003, before we'd even shown the mechanism, that he designed all those meals around the idea that there was this 2 gram leucine threshold. It's pretty cool. Yes?
So I know there's not an answer to this, but I'm wondering if there's hints in the data. So we end up with kind of consistent recommendations, right? 30 to 50 grams of protein, 4 hours a day. Is there any hint that more variability ends up being better? So,
oh, in terms of food intake, like protein sources?
Yeah. Ultimately, maybe it's better to have 90 grams in one meal, 30 in another.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Minimum, 60 in another. Long-term changes, anything like that you see?
I've never seen anything to suggest that kind of undulating it. Now, I've never seen it directly examined either. Right. But based on what I know about protein synthesis, the response is typically pretty repeated. So, like, for example, we took, in that 11-week study, we measured protein synthesis, day 1 and then day 77. And the response was almost exactly the same. Honestly, what's that?
That's the max that's been studied.
It's the max that's been studied, but if you inject me with true serum and ask you to give my personal opinion, I think it's probably higher than that is safe. I mean, Dr. Garlick, who was at University of Illinois, he kind of went digging through the data to see if he could show any protein kind of toxicity effects on the organs and those sorts of things in healthy people. And the only thing he found was in a single amino acid study. There was a case in a hospital where somebody forgot to carry a few decimals, and they gave somebody, I think it was like 100 or 1,000 times more methionine than they were supposed to get IV, and it killed them. So that was the only toxicity he was able to find. But it looks like in people who already have healthy kidney that it doesn't seem to have an effect, or it doesn't seem to have a negative effect. Now, I'm not ready to say go eat 500 grams of protein and that's going to be fine for you. And even my friend Peter Fitchen at the University of Illinois, he actually did a study, I think it was stage 2 renal failure, I believe that's where it was, where he actually supplemented people with 25 grams of whey protein isolate, and they actually had better health outcomes than people who weren't getting that extra protein. Because you're...
I wonder if it even makes a difference, like how hydrated the person is.
Oh, I'm sure it does. Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, sure, absolutely. I do not profess to be a kidney expert, because I'm not. But my understanding of the data is that it's almost more of a total solute load on the kidneys that really makes a difference, because if you get glucose too high, I mean, that can damage the kidneys too. So I think it's more of a total solute load on the kidneys. And yeah, I think protein's kind of gotten a bad rap in terms of that. I think in healthy people, it's pretty safe. Right.
Too. So if you don't have enough protein, then your kidney will start shrinking.
Yeah, and actually there's data that shows that, like, I believe, I might butcher this study, but I believe there was a study that showed that they were giving kind of normal protein diets, like 0.8 grams per kilo. So low in terms of what I'm talking about, but normal in terms of the RDA, versus 0.4 grams per kilo, which is what they kind of clinically recommend if you have a kidney problem. And they actually found that the people getting normal were actually better off. And part of that may be because if you have, renal disease, part of it is, yes, you're creating a little bit more load on the kidney, but also that kidney is not going to be able to recover as well if it doesn't have enough protein. So it's a balancing act, which is why branched-chain keto acids may be so useful for people with kidney disease. So you take the keto acid, which has no nitrogen, and it can recycle some of the nitrogen in your body to form branched-chain amino acids that can have a positive effect on the kidney. There's actually some studies I seem to recall that had a positive effect with branched-chain keto acids.
I'll just say a quick comment. If you look in GISSN for a last name of Lowry, he did a really good study in free-living people, those who are taking in high protein, so protein seekers versus non, and they actually looked at GFR, and that actually went up, but like damage of kidney damage, like via microalbumin, they didn't see any difference. That's probably one of the, at least the better long-term studies I've
Yeah,
seen.
and part of the other.
I'd have to look again, but I want to say it was at least around a gram per pound of body weight, somewhere around there. It was pretty high.
Yeah.
You had a hard time finding people that were exercising a lot, consuming low protein.
Yeah. And part of the problem is a lot of times clinically when we look at labs, we've kind of turned RDs and nurses into this, and then they just read a sheet of paper and they, oh my God, your kidneys are failing because your creatinine is high.
Yeah.
Well, did that person work out yesterday? Or did they? I had a friend who is a competitive bodybuilder. He presented to the hospital with bad GI distress. He's a competitive bodybuilder. This guy squats 3 times a week. I don't know. Do you know Connor? Connor Lavalley?
Yeah.
So he went to the hospital, and he got there, and they looked at his creatine kinase, and it was high. It was like doubled, I think, it was the normal. They said, "Oh my God, you're in rhabdomyolysis." And his mother called me, and I said, "Well, I don't think he's in rhabdo. I'm going to call my friend who's a doctor, but I really don't think so, because for those who are familiar, rhabdomyolysis is where you have such massive protein breakdown that your kidneys can't clear it fast enough, and it ends up shutting down your kidneys." I said, "If you're worried, go have them do a kidney filtration test. Go have them do a sonogram of the kidneys or ultrasound of the kidneys. Make sure everything's okay. But I don't think it's rhabdo, because somebody who's that trained, who's been training for 10 years, is not going to suddenly get rhabdomyolysis." And sure enough, what it was is he just had a really bad stomachache. So. There you go. But we look at these labs, and they, oh my goodness, your creatinine's elevated, or your BUN is elevated, or, well, that, I tell people, I'm like, look, if you have kidney problems, your BUN and creatinine will definitely be elevated. But just because those are elevated does not mean does not problems. And that's, unfortunately, there's a disconnect there where people don't understand that association doesn't equal causation.
Well, when you were presenting, it just came up to my attention. You know how it goes up and down, and up and down with the muscle protein synthesis, and then you also talk about the protein source, right? So,
I know what you're getting at.
No, because you say that the different protein absorbs differently.
Yeah.
And you need it to refract before it starts to synthesize again. So if now in the industry they say combine whey and soy together, so you extend the muscle, the benefit of it.
Right. So I would show them that graph and say, okay, well, what mechanism is it extending it by? Because it can't just be the amino acids. The amino acid availability is not the problem with why protein synthesis falls back down. It's the same thing with the argument with casein. Oh, you guys remember, like every couple of years, the whey versus casein battle comes back out, right? And somebody comes out and says whey's better, and somebody comes out and says casein's better. Well, I remember around, I think it was 2001, there was a series of research that was published from a French group, and they showed that their conclusion was that casein was better than whey. And I found it really puzzling, because they said casein was better than whey, but they didn't feed equal amounts of protein. They equalized the leucine content of it, and so they gave more total casein, and they said casein was better. Well, you gave them more total protein. When they actually normalized the protein content, whey was better. And what's further is that a lot of these studies, you have to be careful, a lot of these studies are done with whole body protein synthesis. Whole body protein synthesis is much different than muscle protein synthesis. Whole body protein synthesis is way more influenced by the gut and liver turnover than muscle protein turnover. Muscle protein turnover is about 1% per day, or even less. It's very slow. Whereas liver and gut turnover around 30 to 60%, or even, I think some gut tissues turn over like 80% per day. Like your GI is completely renewed in 3 days, you know? So when you're looking at whole body protein synthesis, that is much more influenced by those rates of turnover. So every study looking at actual muscle protein synthesis shows that whey is without a doubt better than casein. And as far as like adding the soy, I mean, I just don't see how that's going to help, because it's not an amino acid availability problem. And if we go back, oh, I went too far. Hang on. Hey, look at soy. It's all the way down there. And actually, soy has some funky stuff with it too. Isoflavones, they do weird stuff, man. We haven't published it yet, but we started noticing during our long-term experiment, like, man, these soy animals are really small. Like the biggest soy animal was smaller than the smallest whey animal. Like there wasn't any overlap whatsoever. And they were almost 10% smaller. Yeah, well, here's the thing. They didn't have different levels of body fat. So they didn't have different levels of body fat. Yes?
Wow, that's really interesting, because when you think about soy, has all those isoflavones, and there's also, I don't know if you're familiar with PCOS.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, polycystic ovarian syndrome. Well, they have a lot of issues with their
Yep.
hormones.
Well, and there was even, I believe, a guy from Illinois, just down the hall from us, Helfrich. He published some data that in postmenopausal women that soy actually increased the risk of breast cancer. So I always tell people, like, I have not decided on soy just yet. Because there's some good things the isoflavones do, and there's some really funky stuff they do too.
Well, it's
And
also different with soy if you get it in concentrated powder form versus the fruit.
sure, absolutely, absolutely.
If you get soy in powder,
Yeah.
there's good evidence that more than 25 grams of that could cause cancer. But
Yeah, I mean, it's
that's not.
because you're dealing with concentrated amounts of isoflavones, and those isoflavones are very strong. Because I've had people say, well, I don't eat any soy whatsoever. It's like, well, there's a difference between a soybean or a small amount of soy lecithin or something like that as emulsifier. That's totally different than, 25 grams of soy protein isolate. But, what really disturbs me is the people who give soy formula to their babies, I mean, like I said, it does some good stuff and it does some weird stuff. And all I know is I don't want to be giving it to my baby thinking, all right, kid, you're the guinea pig. Let's see what happens in 20 years. You know what I mean? So, yeah, like I said, there's I don't want to say I don't like soy, but I don't like soy. Typically, because if you get soy high enough, you will get the same response as you get with whey. But the problem is, you get soy high enough, guess what? Now you have really high isoflavone intake. So you're rolling the dice as to whether or not the outcomes are good or bad with that.
So now going back to your comment, how you say, with high amount of soy that can cause the cancer. So you think now in the food industry, right? Since soy is much cheaper, so people go for high concentration of protein, and the manufacturer, what they do is soy is cheap. Okay, I'm putting soy in. So maybe in the future,
That's part of the problem. It's like if you see a lot of like the energy bars and all the darn sports bars out there, 90% of them have soy protein.
Yeah. Well, I gave a similar talk to this at Experimental Biology a few years ago. Mike, were you there in 2010?
Yeah.
Remember that room? They were pretty hostile, weren't they?
The one where Gabe put the picture of Arnold and Layne.
Yeah.
And the whole crowd goes, whoa. We're like, yeah. There's like this mush that falls.
Oh yeah. So I had like a whole row of soy people who were, as soon as I was done with my speech, there's a mic right here, and they all just march up and get in line. They're ready to go. But yeah, I mean, like I said, soy there's some good stuff with soy, but there's also some weird stuff. So it's definitely not anything I'm ready to recommend to people as consume this every day. And even people who say, look, I'm total vegetarian, I don't eat any animal products, I'd say, well, go get some rice protein instead, or add a free-form branched chain amino acid. You know what I mean, like to your protein. But I wouldn't recommend soy.
You know, there's a lot of the stuff that you've, let's say, proven but tested.
Yeah.
Bodybuilders have known anecdotally for years,
Sure.
right? And it's kind of the same thing with soy. Like, you know,
Yeah.
look at Mahler. He's like your poster boy for vegetarianism.
Yeah.
He has to do all this crazy hormonal stuff
Yeah.
to keep things normal.
Yeah.
You know, so
Well,
there's evidence there.
It was funny. Anybody watches the UFC? There was a fighter named John Fitch, who was very, very strong wrestler. Went totally vegetarian and was talking about how bad meat is for you and everything, and how bad dairy is for you. You could literally watch him shrink over the last 5 years. And his fight record got worse because he wasn't able to bully people around. He was a guy who would take somebody, push him up against the cage, and be able to throw him down to the ground eventually. And he couldn't do that by the end of he's out of the UFC now. He was a guy who went from a title contender to nothing. So I blame it on the vegetarian diet.
Okay, some of the other like vegan, powdered proteins,
Yeah.
they have pea protein.
Yes.
So how is that?
I believe pea protein is like 8.5% leucine, I think. They say it's high leucine, but it's really kind of middle of the pack. I mean,
it's higher than wheat, and where does it fall?
it's higher than wheat. So let's see here.
If you compare it to the wheat, soy, and egg, and
Yeah. We'll go less so right in between here. So literally middle of the pack.
So it's more than the chicken?
I think it's like slightly more than chicken. I'm not sure about this chicken number. I think this is probably closer to 8. I think that's probably closer to 8. But yeah, so pea protein probably better than like a soy or a wheat, but definitely not as good. I mean, everything's kind of bunched up together in this. And then boom, you have milk, which is a full % higher than everything else. And then boom, you have whey, which is another full % higher,
If you have like a true vegan,
Right.
you're not gonna
Sure.
eat whey,
Right. So if it's a true vegan,
that would be a better choice.
pea protein, or I would tell them, look, here, to each meal add, a gram of leucine or something like that. And then you're going to ensure that they're hitting the threshold.
So can you get powdered, pure, plain
Oh, yeah.
leucine?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Or branch chain. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you for the wonderful presentation. And I have last question that is not related to this, but I want to know, you come out across really passionate and love what you do. Like, what's the motivation behind that?
Whew, I got picked on a lot as a kid. I really like what I do. I've talked to, I get a lot of people who message me, and I guess they see that too, and they say, I want to do what you do, or I want to do this, or how do I do this? I'm worried about having a job. I'm worried about this, and I say, look, job security is kind of the great big myth and the great big lie, because when I actually, a good story is the first speech I gave after I was out of graduate school and working for myself, I owned my own company. I was there with a bunch of my academic friends who were now professors and involved with academia. And they said, man, how do you do it? You're so brave. Like, you got to go out and get it on your own. We get a steady paycheck. I said, yeah, but what happens if the school's funding gets cut? What happens if somebody above you screws up? Okay? Your ability to make money is only as good as the guy above you, or the person above you. I'm not going to fire me, at least I hope not. The only person going to fire me, would be the other person I live with, and I don't think she's going to fire me either. So, it's, I truly believe that if you love what you do, it comes across, and when I was, at touring Divisco, one of the things I was impressed with was how much, people are giving the tour and knew about it. They knew about the family, and they loved the family, and, it was so important to them to do a good job. And so that was kind of cool to see that. And I don't know, I'm a big fan of passion. I think that, I don't think I'm that much smarter than anybody else. I don't think I'm that much, inherently better than anybody else. Like in terms of like when I do bodybuilding or powerlifting, I was a little scrawny runt kid. I just really, really like what I do, and so it makes it easy to get out of bed and go do it, So I guess that's the long-winded answer to that question.
to say thank you very much for coming here today, and thank you all of you for being here. I learned a lot about leucine now and how it's different from other amino acids and the importance of it. So after this, we're going to have a small reception, so please join us for some food and drinks. And so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.